From the outside it looked like a perfectly coordinated takedown, a wave of whispers, headlines, and viral clips all aimed at one person, Blake Lively, they said. She was behind a secret smear campaign. They said she was pulling strings in the background to damage careers, silence critics, and protect her own image. But now, as the receipts fail to materialize and the so-called evidence begins to crumble, that narrative is falling apart faster than it was built. What started as gossip turned into a wildfire, spreading across platforms, with content creators, influencers, and media outlets racing to be the first to expose her. But here's the truth behind the curtain. Behind the sensational headlines and anonymous claims, there was nothing. No smoking gun, no strategy, no campaign, just speculation dressed up as certainty. And a digital audience hungry for scandal and drama. The internet loves a villain, especially one as polished as Blake Lively. But when the facts refused to line up and the timelines started to contradict themselves, people began to ask the one question that had been ignored from the beginning: where is the actual proof? What followed was not just a retraction of claims, but a total collapse of the story. And as creators quietly deleted posts, edited captions, and removed videos, one thing became clear: this was never about truth, it was about clicks, narratives, and outrage. The smear campaign never existed, but the consequences of believing it did are very real. And now the spotlight has shifted not onto Blake Lively, but onto the people who pushed a story without checking if it was true. This is what happens when fiction goes viral, and the damage is already done. The real question now is who will take accountability and who will pretend they were never a part of it. At all moment, rumors began swirling around Blake Lively, suggesting she was behind some elaborate smear campaign. It instantly ignited a firestorm across Hollywood, the internet, and nearly every gossip blog in the country. But as the dust begins to settle, and the evidence or lack thereof starts to reveal itself, a completely different story is emerging, one that paints a chaotic picture of assumptions, hearsay, and exaggerated narratives that never quite held up in the first place. People wanted a villain, and for a brief moment Blake Lively fit the part too perfectly. But now, with witnesses walking back their statements, documents not lining up, and timelines beginning to contradict themselves, the entire smear campaign theory is starting to collapse under its own weight. And what's left behind is a trail of questionable reporting and suspiciously timed leaks that have backfired spectacularly for those who tried to push it forward. At the heart of this media circus is a narrative that was never properly verified, yet was amplified across social platforms, traditional outlets, and influencer accounts, all hungry for clicks and controversy. There was a strange magnetism to the idea that Blake had some master plan to ruin reputations, silence critics, and control narratives from behind the scenes. But when you look past the surface and actually dig into the details, the story just doesn't add up. What we now see is a timeline littered with inconsistencies, contradictions, and most damning of all, silence from those who initially championed the smear claims. When asked for receipts, it became a dance of vagueness and deflection. When pressed for clarity, it turned into a storm of deleted posts, private messages, and altered captions, all trying to rewrite a story that never had a solid foundation. To begin with, it all started with whispers that Blake had allegedly coordinated efforts to discredit certain public figures, particularly those tied to ongoing controversies within the Hollywood ecosystem. But as legal filings began surfacing and deposition transcripts were quietly released under court orders, the tone shifted drastically. These documents didn't just fail to confirm the smear campaign claims, they actively dismantled the key points used to fuel the outrage. A prominent moment came when a highly circulated message thread claimed to show Blake's team reaching out to tabloid editors, pushing a narrative about one of her supposed rivals. But later verification efforts proved the screenshots were altered, the timestamps didn't match, and the supposed editor involved released a public statement saying they'd never spoken to anyone in her camp, let alone participated in a smear campaign. This triggered a ripple effect across platforms. Creators who had rushed to cover the story were suddenly faced with a dilemma: do they double down or walk it back? Some attempted to pivot, subtly changing video titles, adjusting thumbnails, or even posting vague disclaimers. Others simply went silent, hoping the scandal fatigue would push attention elsewhere. But for audiences who had already seen the drama unfold, the damage was done, and the reversal only added fuel to the backlash. There's also the matter of the so-called anonymous insiders who came forward claiming to have knowledge of Blake's alleged involvement. But what wasn't initially disclosed is that many of these sources had pre-existing beef with Blake from past professional interactions. Some were former employees, others had ties to competing projects, and nearly all of them refused to go on record, even under sealed court filings. As one legal analyst pointed out during a breakdown of the case, if your main source won't sign an affidavit, it doesn't hold up in a court of law or public opinion. Once that came to light, suddenly those explosive anonymous revelations didn't seem quite so solid anymore. And then there's the question of motive. What would Blake have gained from orchestrating such a campaign? Most of the individuals targeted were not threats to her career, nor were they involved in any current projects that overlapped with her own ventures. In fact, the majority of them had no direct ties to her personal or professional life, making the entire premise feel far more like projection than strategy. Yet despite all of these contradictions, the narrative persisted for weeks, amplified by viral tweets, slickly edited exposed videos, and sensationalized headlines. One particularly viral post claimed to have audio evidence of Blake instructing her team to leak unflattering information about a colleague. But when the clip was finally released, it was clearly manipulated, cobbled together from unrelated interviews with inconsistent background noise and mismatched timestamps. Not only was it not damning, it was laughably transparent in its attempt to frame her, and still the story spread. The thirst for drama had overtaken the need for accuracy, and the moment people started seeing cracks in the narrative, they doubled down, rather than admit the foundation was flawed at every level. But here's where it really began to crumble: when legal teams got involved, and actual court subpoenas were issued to social media companies, media outlets, and alleged leakers. The real picture started to emerge. Metadata didn't match, timelines proved impossible, and most damning of all, some of the most circulated claims were outright fabrications. Some involved content that was never posted, some screenshots showed messages that didn't exist in the platform's back-end logs, and others were attributed to people who denied ever writing them in the first place. It became a forensic dismantling of digital deception, and it was not only embarrassing for the people who had championed the smear campaign theory, it was potentially actionable and illegal sense, because fabricating evidence to support a defamation narrative opens up serious liabilities, and several parties are now facing possible repercussions for pushing stories that are being called demonstrably false by multiple legal teams involved in the matter. This moment is particularly critical because it reflects a larger shift in how celebrity narratives are weaponized and dismantled in the digital age, where one tweet or edited voice note can launch an entire media cycle, but also where the truth eventually catches up and exposes how flimsy some of these orchestrations really are. Blake Lively might not be the most universally adored figure in Hollywood, but she is no stranger to media manipulation, and this situation has exposed not her capacity to orchestrate a campaign, but rather how easily one can be orchestrated against her using just a few viral assets and a willing audience looking for scandal. In the end, the smear campaign theory appears to have been just that, a theory, one that thrived on suggestion rather than substance, on implication rather than confirmation. And as the smoke clears, the people who once amplified the loudest accusations are now quietly stepping back, deleting posts, editing timelines, and pretending they were never part of the echo chamber in the first place. And that silence speaks volumes, louder perhaps than any accusation ever could. Because when the receipts are missing, when the dots refuse to connect, and when the loudest voices go quiet, it usually means the narrative has reached its expiration date. And that's exactly where this story is heading. As the unraveling of the smear campaign theory continued, what became increasingly clear was how much of the narrative had been constructed around selective framing, out of context remarks, and a chain reaction of speculation disguised as fact. It started with a single comment taken from an old interview, where Blake discussed boundaries in Hollywood and respect among peers. Somehow, that quote was spun into a theory that she was subtly targeting a specific individual, though she never mentioned any names, nor did she imply malice. The quote alone became fuel for an entire internet cycle. Built on a foundation of assumption, from there came a cascade of influencer commentary, breaking down her tone, her body language, even her wardrobe, as if these things confirmed guilt and intent. What was missing from all of it, however, was proof. And not just proof in the legal sense, but proof in the most basic factual sense: actual timelines, text messages, emails, or testimony that supported the theory. None of it materialized. Instead, what we got were digital collages, edited videos, and anonymous statements that fell apart the moment they were questioned. And despite the mounting lack of substance, the narrative pushed forward, bolstered by creators who either believed the story too deeply or were too invested to admit it might be wrong. Some used words like allegedly or reportedly to shield themselves, but the framing was always clear. This was being presented as truth, even though the sources were flimsy and unverified. There was a viral document circulating that claimed to be a list of people Blake had supposedly blacklisted in the industry, but a quick look at the metadata showed it was created weeks after the scandal began and not by anyone affiliated with her team. In fact, one of the names listed publicly called it out saying they had never had a negative interaction with Blake and considered her professional and respectful. That post barely received a fraction of the attention the list did, highlighting how misinformation spreads faster and sticks harder than the corrections ever could. Another key piece that completely fell apart was the allegation that Blake had planted a story in a major entertainment outlet aimed at smearing another actor. The problem is, when the outlet was contacted, their editorial team confirmed there was no record of such a pitch, nor was there any story in their archives matching the description, yet that story continued to be cited across multiple platforms, treated as a known fact even though no such article ever existed. And when asked to present a screenshot or link, supporters of the smear campaign theory either deflected or went silent. This is what happens when narrative overtakes reality, when engagement becomes more valuable than accuracy, and when creators chase drama over truth. Entire cycles are created around a myth, and even when the myth collapses, the damage is already done. And while some outlets issued quiet retractions, others never corrected the record at all, choosing instead to move on to the next controversy, leaving the falsehoods behind to quietly fester in the public consciousness. And this isn't just a Blake Lively issue, it's a pattern in modern media where celebrity scandals become clickbait machines and no one stops to ask whether the story actually makes sense. In this case, the more you analyze the claims, the more you saw how improbable they were. Timelines that didn't align, conversations that contradicted each other, and supposed insiders who couldn't provide verifiable information. And yet for a time the theory thrived because it offered a compelling villain narrative, and because audiences are conditioned to believe in orchestrated drama behind every red carpet smile. But what was most striking was how people who had worked closely with Blake began speaking out, not in defense of her character necessarily, but to debunk the logistics of the smear campaign theory. One former producer explained how the idea of her running a coordinated media hit job was laughable given the layers of vetting that go into even the smallest industry stories. Another colleague noted that during a high-profile project where several rumors were circulating, Blake had actually been the one urging the team to stay quiet and not engage with gossip, suggesting that if anything she was more cautious than controlling. And these testimonies weren't from hired PR teams, they came from behind-the-scenes professionals with no reason to lie, which only added to the growing realization that the entire narrative might have been built on fiction dressed up as journalism. One of the more revealing moments came when a podcast that had previously hosted a segment claiming to expose Blake's alleged media manipulation quietly removed the episode without explanation. Listeners noticed the deletion, and when asked why, the hosts gave a vague response about wanting to maintain editorial standards, but the implication was clear: something didn't hold up. And rather than risk liability or public blowback, they chose to distance themselves from the content entirely, and that says a lot about the confidence they had in their own reporting, or rather the lack of it. Because when a story starts crumbling, the first sign is always retraction or silence. And that's what we began to see across the board: creators either deleting content or pivoting to new topics altogether, hoping no one would notice the quiet retreat from a theory that had once consumed the algorithm. The fallout from this is not just about Blake Lively, it's about what happens when internet narratives are treated like courtroom evidence, and when online opinion becomes more influential than actual facts. In a world where every piece of content is instantly judged, reshared, and weaponized, we risk replacing truth with trend. And that is precisely what this saga revealed: that the smear campaign theory wasn't just false, it was hollow, a collection of assumptions masked as insight. And the only thing it ever truly exposed was how easily the internet can be manipulated into believing almost anything given the right aesthetics, timing, and a few viral posts. The implications for creators are serious, because some may now be facing legal consequences for defamatory claims, especially if they knowingly pushed false information for clicks and engagement. There are even reports that subpoenas may be issued to identify who created the forged document and whether any money exchanged hands in promoting the false narrative. If that happens, the story will shift from speculation to prosecution, and what began as internet drama could turn into a cautionary tale about digital accountability. And while the internet moves fast and public attention shifts even faster, the people falsely accused in this saga will carry the impact long after the trending hashtags fade, because reputational harm lingers even when the story is debunked. And that's why these narratives matter. They shape perceptions, they influence careers, and when they're based on fiction, they erode trust, not just in individuals but in the entire ecosystem of content creation and media discourse. And that erosion has become harder to ignore, especially now, as more details emerge and more creators admit they may have gone too far. In the pursuit of virality, and that moment of reflection, though long overdue, is the only path toward rebuilding credibility, and it starts with recognizing that in the case of Blake Lively, the smear campaign didn't just fall apart. It exposed the cracks in an entire system built to reward outrage over accuracy and sensationalism over substance. As the public slowly began to absorb the reality that the smear campaign theory lacked substance, a shift in tone began to ripple across social media. What had once been an avalanche of confident accusations started to morph into quiet backtracking. Suddenly, creators were using softer language, questioning earlier claims and suggesting that perhaps things were more complicated than originally presented. Some even began to imply that they had never fully endorsed the theory to begin with, that they were just sharing information or providing commentary, but audiences remembered. And the internet does not forget. What followed was a subtle but powerful reckoning, not in the form of dramatic apologies or public statements, but in the eerie silence that took over once the fabricated narrative began to implode. The irony of it all is that the very creators who had accused Blake of media manipulation found themselves caught in their own cycle of narrative control, carefully adjusting their content to save face while avoiding accountability entirely. And this selective rewriting of digital history only deepened the mistrust from viewers, who felt they had been misled. One of the most telling moments came when a former collaborator of Blake, who had remained silent for most of the controversy, released a detailed thread outlining their experience working with her. The thread painted a picture of professionalism, transparency, and caution, not exactly the traits one would expect from someone orchestrating a covert campaign against industry peers. The thread went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was rooted in lived experience and countered the popular narrative with calm, measured clarity. It was the first time in weeks that something resembling truth had cut through the noise, and audiences took notice. It inspired others to come forward, not just in defense of Blake, but to challenge the way misinformation had been allowed to fester unchecked in a digital landscape built to reward chaos and drama. A handful of journalists followed up with deeper reporting, tracing the origins of the smear campaign theory to a few now discredited sources and a network of interconnected posts that created the illusion of consensus, when in fact most of the claims could be traced back to a single anonymous forum thread that had been taken out of context and blown out of proportion. Once that connection was exposed, it dismantled one of the final pillars holding up the smear campaign theory, and revealed how digital narratives are often built not on fact, but on the velocity of repetition. The more something is said, the more people believe it. And the more it is believed, the harder it is to question, even when the foundation is crumbling. In this case, the damage extended beyond Blake Lively. It raised uncomfortable questions about the responsibility of influencers, journalists, and everyday users in shaping public opinion in a world where a viral clip can shape headlines and a trending hashtag can dictate news cycles. The line between commentary and complicity has become dangerously blurred, and in the wake of this collapsed narrative, many are beginning to confront that reality in private conversations, on public panels, and in cautious editorial shifts. There is a growing acknowledgement that the smear campaign theory was a case study in how quickly misinformation can metastasize, and how few tools exist to stop it once it gains momentum. Because while platforms may flag content or issue fact checks, those measures rarely match the reach of the original falsehood, and more importantly, they often come too late to undo the reputational harm already done. As one digital media analyst put it, the internet has a short memory but a long shadow. Once something is said online, it never fully disappears, and its consequences can linger long after the truth surfaces. And that truth is what finally began to take shape as more creators, journalists, and insiders stepped forward to clarify, retract, and even apologize in some cases. And while not every participant in the smear campaign narrative took responsibility enough, did to spark a broader conversation about what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Some platforms began issuing quiet policy updates aimed at reducing the spread of unverified claims. Others launched internal reviews into how their trending algorithms may have amplified false narratives in ways that created real-world harm. And though these efforts are small, they signal a recognition that something systemic failed in this case, that the internet allowed a baseless theory to thrive while silencing or sidelining those who questioned it. And that is a dangerous precedent, because it means that anyone with enough followers and a compelling enough story can rewrite reality, at least temporarily. And if not for the meticulous work of a few determined individuals who followed the receipts and asked the right questions, the smear campaign theory may have endured even longer, unchecked and unchallenged. And that is perhaps the most important takeaway from this entire saga: that truth still matters, that facts can still prevail, but only if people are willing to do the work to uncover them. and resist the temptation to believe the first version of the story they hear or see, especially when that story is packaged for virality and built on aesthetic, not accuracy. In the case of Blake Lively, the smear campaign has all but collapsed, and in its place is a cautionary tale for creators, fans, journalists, and platforms alike, a reminder that even in a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, it is still possible to ask questions, demand proof, and slow down long enough to separate the signal from the noise. And that act of slowing down, of seeking the truth rather than the trend, is what ultimately dismantled this narrative and offered a glimpse into what more responsible digital discourse might look like moving forward. It is not perfect, and it will not undo all the damage done to Blake's reputation, but it is a start, and in a world where public perception is shaped in seconds, a start is better than silence. And for those who care about truth, about integrity, about the health of our digital ecosystem, that small beginning matters, because if the internet can be used to build a lie, it can also be used to reveal the truth. And in this case, that truth has finally come into focus, even if it took longer than it should have. In the end, the story that promised to unravel Blake Lively's career turned out to be the real fabrication. And while the theory of a secret smear campaign dominated headlines and social feeds for weeks, what it ultimately revealed was not a master manipulator working behind the scenes, but an online ecosystem where rumors thrive faster than facts, and where perception can be manufactured with just a few well-placed tweets and a wave of willing amplification. What we witnessed was not the exposure of Blake Lively's alleged dark side, but the exposure of how easily narratives can be constructed without evidence, how a few unverified claims can spiral into a full-blown media firestorm, and how silence or caution is often interpreted as guilt rather than prudence. The internet wanted a villain, and for a brief moment it made Blake Lively the perfect one. Polished, successful, and relatively quiet, she became a blank canvas for projection and speculation. And even as the story began to fall apart piece by piece, many were hesitant to admit they had been wrong. But now that the dust has settled and the facts have been laid bare, the truth is unavoidable. The smear campaign was never real, but the consequences of pretending it was have been deeply felt. And not just by Blake Lively, but by the very creators, journalists, and platforms that lent credibility to a false narrative without vetting their sources or considering the damage they were causing. The situation should be a wake-up call, not just for those who engaged with it, but for the entire culture of digital media. It is a lesson in the importance of verification, accountability, and the danger of prioritizing virality over accuracy. And while Blake may move on and recover from this in time, the deeper issue remains: how many more reputations will be damaged by the next baseless theory? How many more creators will chase engagement at the expense of truth? And how many platforms will allow misinformation to thrive unchecked until the consequences become too large to ignore? The good news is that this moment can spark change. It can push us to demand more from our sources, to think more critically about what we share, and to remember that behind every headline and every trending topic there are real people with real lives who can be affected by even the smallest lie. Blake Lively did not orchestrate a smear campaign, but she became the target of one built not by her, but by those who chose to believe and promote a narrative without doing the work to prove it. And now, as that narrative collapses, all that remains is a cautionary tale, one that reminds us that in the digital age, truth is fragile but not powerless, and that it is our responsibility to protect it, even when it is not popular, even when it is not profitable, even when it challenges the stories we want to believe, because only then can we begin to build a more honest and accountable media landscape for everyone.